What we risk is allowing our voice to be muted if we don't demand equal access and equal treatment. We can trust that, if the gospel goes forth, it won't return void.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Framework Leadership, where we talk with leaders from across the globe and explore their leadership techniques, strategies for guiding organizations to achieve success and growth. I'm your host, Ken Engel, president of Southeastern University.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Steiner, senior vice president for advancement and innovation.
And we're excited today to introduce our guests for the show, Jeremy Tedesco. Jeremy serves as senior counsel, senior vice president of corporate engagement for the Alliance Defending Freedom. He's a leading voice in highlighting religious threats and censorship that some major corporations pose to many Americans. And Jeremy, we're just grateful to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I want to open up our conversation with a topic that no leader should ignore, absolutely shouldn't ignore. It's something that affects all of us, and that is global censorship. As leaders, we have to acknowledge how ideas and of course, speech and influence are being shaped, filtered, and sometimes outright controlled in every corner of the world. Why do you think censorship, especially around religious speech, has become such a heated battleground in today's culture? How did we get to where we are?
Well, I think there's a lot that contributes to it. But one of the things that's really on the rise is a demand for protective measures, what are called protective measures, something that protect democracy or protect, individuals from what a lot of folks are calling harmful speech. They define that in terms like hate speech or misinformation. And the reality is you have powerful institutions like the UN, powerful institutions in the U.S., on the government and the for-profit side, who are implementing policies like hate speech, like misinformation, that can be wielded to shut down speech that they don't like. And all too often we've seen, especially hate speech policies, but even policies on misinformation, be used to justify restrictions on religious speech or other kind of conservative or religious values that are out of vogue right now in some of the elite institutions, whether they be government or for-profit companies.
Yeah. Why do governments and corporations feel the need to control information if they believe their narrative is already the right one? I mean, for example, Brazil's attempt to ban X in their nation, Instagram taking down posts for false information, the Bank of America booting the charity Indigenous Advanced Ministries. How do you see all this unfolding in the months to come?
Yeah, it's hard to understand why the censors censor. I mean, they obviously can't believe that their ideas are right or will win out in a fair debate or dialogue. I mean, if you believe that, then you have no reason to censor.
Right.
You have every reason to engage in the public square and try to convince and, ultimately argue with evidence and reason so that your ideas win the day. So what we're seeing is instead of an openness to debate and dialogue and a trust in the process to lead us to the right conclusions, a desire to be arbiters of truth, the deciders of what's right and wrong, what opinions can be, expressed and which ones cannot. Mm-hmm. And then we have these concentrations of power, whether they be in the government or in the private sector, where there's these attempts to take over those nexus points of power and use them to censor and to shut down speech that people don't like. So that is essentially what's going on. And, we're seeing it certainly from the government. We're seeing it also from private companies. And I think even worse than that, we're seeing it where those two entities, those two kind of powerful forces in our culture are colluding or collaborating to censor as well. And so, it's bad enough when it's coming at you from the government or from the private sector, but when they're collaborating and colluding to censor, that's a real problem with the amount of control and influence that private corporations have over the public square today.
And talk a little bit more about that control that private corporations have, because I think we see a lot of the big headlines, right? About government, Brazil, and that kind of thing. But I don't know if a lot of folks understand what's happening at private sectors and what companies are doing to censor. Can you talk about that for a second?
Well, because we're in a digital age, one of the aspects of the digital age is that the public square is no longer controlled or owned by the government. It's really owned and controlled by private companies. And so, not only do they control the public square through social media companies and some of the obvious ways in which they control it. So, if you can't have a Twitter account, or you get blocked on Facebook because Facebook doesn't like your views, you were effectively pushed outside of the public conversations that are going on, in today's day and age. But these technology companies especially also own a lot of the infrastructure that the communication channels of today are built on top of. So if you are unable to get platformed,
Right.
can't have your web hosted, are being boxed out of essential technological infrastructure, that is the building block to your ability to reach and communicate and impact the world for whatever purpose you have, then that becomes a real problem as well. So there's all these choke points that are involved in the process. Certainly the ones that get the headlines are, my YouTube video got taken down,
Right.
or I lost my Twitter handle. But there's also that kind of underlying technological infrastructure that's really critical that we continue to have access to be able to communicate our ideas.
And what do you say to those that say that social media companies are private, so they can do whatever they want to? They can censor. I mean, that's kind of the other side of the narrative there on that part.
Sure. I mean, they don't have to comply with the First Amendment unless they're collaborating with the government. So, understand that if they are colluding in some way with the government in a censorship scheme, then the First Amendment applies to their actions.
For sure.
But when they're acting in their private capacity, then, they do have the right to permit what content they want and what content they don't want. But I think the response to that is they need to understand the sacred duty they have as the entities that control the public square. If people are going to get on, social media today for most of their information, and that's where they're expressing their ideas and engaging in public debate and dialogue, then the companies need to have policies and practices that allow the broadest possible speech to be expressed on those platforms, so that we don't have private companies manipulating public debate and where these conversations lead from a policy solutions perspective any more than the government should be involved in that kind of activity.
Yeah, I want to ask you about like debanking, where companies are being denied funds because of their religious stances. What impact does debanking have on censoring companies right here in America? And what do you see as the most significant threat to free speech posed by some of these major corporations today?
Yeah, well, debanking is definitely on the rise, and that's essentially, losing access to financial services because of your religious or political views. We have seen a significant uptick in that. We collect stories of debanking on our website, viewpointdiversityscore.org, and one of the most egregious examples of it, you've mentioned Bank of America back in 2023, April of 2023, debanked Indigenous Advanced Ministries, which is a humanitarian relief and aid organization that works in Uganda. And just, they do amazing work there. They provide, water, wells, they build schools, they pull people out of sex trafficking. I mean, they're really there to serve some of the most destitute people in the world. And Bank of America closed their account out of the blue. They had the account there for at least 8 years, just sent them a letter out of the blue that said, look, you've got 30 days. We don't want to do business with people who have your business type any longer. And they also sent them a letter saying, your risk profile exceeds our risk tolerance. So they were left scrambling to try to find, some other place to bank. In the meantime, it made it impossible for them to pay people on the ground in Uganda who are essential to the support they provide to people on the ground. And so it was very disruptive to the ministry, very harmful to people on the ground in Uganda who relied on that ministry for putting food on the table for their families.
Right.
So this is a real problem. It's happening to Christian ministries. It wasn't just that Christian ministry that got canceled. It was also a local church in Tennessee that provided support to that ministry. Got canceled by Bank of America too. So, this problem is on the rise, and it poses a real problem to people being able to provide to get access to basic financial services. I mean, if if you can't have access to a bank account, a credit card, loans, you can't do business in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's critically important that banks provide their services on a viewpoint neutral basis.
Love it. And so, what is, when we're talking about this, because this is obviously going a little bit beyond free speech, right? This is not just like, you're infringing my ability to believe. Or, well, what part of the Constitution are we talking about here? I mean, what are the aspects? What are the things that at play when we're talking about a company being debanked?
Well, here's the thing. The banks themselves are private entities, but they are private entities that are heavily, heavily regulated by the federal government, especially those that have national charters.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that regulation is taking into account what's called reputational risk.
Mm.
And the problem is that these regulators who have extreme level of control over the day-to-day operations of these banks will sometimes weaponize the concept of reputational risk against disfavored industries because of their views or their activities or some other reason. Totally legal industries, but the regulators will say, well, we don't want you to provide services to these, this sector any longer. And they'll put pressure on the banks to pull back services and to ratchet back financial products. And so this has happened. We know it's happened. There's, plenty of evidence that this has happened in the past. And so it's a real risk. And that's why, to answer your question, what's the constitutional issue involved? Well, the banking sector, especially the nationally chartered banks, where does the public sector begin and the private sector end when it comes to banks? I mean, it's very much a gray area.
Wow.
And lots of times the banks hide behind this kind of secrecy that's involved in banking regulation and banking supervision. So they don't have to tell a client why they got debanked. So it's really hard. There's a lack of transparency for people who have been debanked to figure out why they have been. Was it the government who forced them out of the banking relationship? Was it the bank who did it of their own accord? Was it some combination of the two? And so there's definitely First Amendment interests involved here. If the banks are debanking religious institutions because of pressure from the government, that's a First Amendment problem. But from our perspective, whether the banks are doing it because the government wants them to do it or some internal, group of employees are demanding it or some external activists are demanding it, banks should not be in the business of weaponizing their services in the cultural, conversations of the day.
Yeah. The Indigenous Advanced Ministries, did they take any kind of action? What did they do to resolve that, or was there any action taken?
Well, that's part of the problem is that when institutions are debanked like this, there's not a lot of strong legal remedies right now. So what we did with Indigenous Advance was ultimately use their story to help get a law passed in Tennessee that bars debanking based on religious or political beliefs and on the basis of other kind of ESG factors that are so in vogue right now. And so Indigenous Advance's story resulted in broad-based protections for every citizen of Tennessee against the kind of debanking that Indigenous Advance suffered. And we hope that legislation becomes a model for other states to follow and implement.
And that's really the only state in the United States that has taken that kind of action, correct?
Florida has a similar law. Tennessee's is a little different, but Florida and Tennessee are the two states that right now have taken some steps in that direction.
And that would encompass, I know we were talking debanking, but just deplatforming in general. Would that cover all of just whatever organization that does that kind of practice, correct?
It's going to cover just debanking. It's not going to cover deplatforming by social media companies.
Okay. Talk to us a little bit about...
Those are two kind of distinct issues.
Yeah, talk about deplatforming.
Well, deplatforming is a huge problem too, and we talked on it a little bit earlier with social media companies and others, essentially weaponizing hate speech policies, misinformation policies that bar offensive speech or intolerant speech. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you see in social media company terms of service. Now, the interesting thing about it is if the government had policies like that in place and restricted speech on the basis of those policies, it would be an easy First Amendment violation. It'd be an easy court win. But because it's private companies, they can have those policies, but should they? Well, first of all, like I said before, if the government's forcing them or coercing them to use those policies to restrict speech, then that's a First Amendment violation. But if the companies themselves are regulating the public square, regulating the ability of people to speak on issues of the day through those same kinds of policies, it's going to result in the same kind of censorship that the government engages in when they have those kind of policies in place. So one of the arguments we make to the companies all the time is you're not bound by the First Amendment, but you should learn from the First Amendment principles about how do you create a speech forum that's open to the broadest amount of views and that avoids this kind of viewpoint discrimination. There's clear guideposts and ways to get that done under the First Amendment that, yes, the companies don't have to follow because they're private companies, but if they're running a forum that they say is open to free speech, then why don't you use the best standards on the planet for operating that kind of platform free of censorship?
Do you think this is going to take legislative or even like legal precedent? I mean, we're talking Supreme Court precedent or something. Is it going to have to take to that level in order to solve this? And what kind of shape would that take?
I mean, I think in some instances, yes, but I don't think we can resort to those as the only solution, litigation or even legislation. One of the things that we do is we have a product called the Viewpoint Diversity Score Index, which rates the big tech and finance companies on their respect for free speech and religious freedom. So we do a diagnostic of all their policies and practices that impact free speech and religious freedom. And then we engage with them on various different ways. But one of the most effective ways is we use a shareholder engagement model where we ask shareholders who own shares in those companies to engage directly with the companies on these issues and tell them, look, we're concerned about this policy, this practice, things that you're doing that, clearly violate your commitment to free speech and the ability of your customers and users to engage in free speech on your platforms, and we want you to change them. And so let me give you an example in the DeBanking context where this has worked already. We engaged directly with JP Morgan Chase on a social risk policy they had for years on their payment processor side of their business, which basically said they could debank you for promoting what they considered to be intolerance or hate. Well, they had actually used that policy to debank people for political and religious reasons in the past. And after 3 or so years of a successive pressure from us and from shareholders, just kind of holding them accountable to a depoliticized provision of services, they decided to get rid of that policy altogether. So that protects millions of JP Morgan Chase customers, they're the biggest bank in the world, from these kind of discriminatory policies and behaviors. So, to answer your question, it's a long way of saying I don't think the only solution resides in litigation and regulation. We do need those solutions, but we can also engage these companies directly through the shareholder proxy process, just through persuasion and evidence to demonstrate to them that it's a better path for them to avoid these kind of policies so they extract themselves from the demands that they deploy their services in service of some kind of political ideology.
Yeah. As we wrap up our conversation, what do you think is the most important step leaders can take today to protect free speech and ensure that open dialogue really continues to thrive in our society despite all the pressures and challenges? Obviously, when elections happen, your vote matters. That counts. I mean, you're starting to hear language from some of our candidates that are saying, talking about your speech is not necessarily a right, but it's a privilege, and that kind of language is a little bit troubling if you think about it, because our Constitution guarantees us the right to free speech. So what steps can we take to help protect free speech?
I think it's really important to get fully engaged in the efforts to protect free speech and religious freedom in these kind of power centers in our society where we're seeing more and more violations. So, every one of us is a shareholder, probably through our 401ks or otherwise of these corporations. So you have a voice in the way those companies are run. And if you don't like the way that Google restricts content, or, Facebook or Meta, their parent company, restricts posts on, Facebook, then you have a voice, and you can reach out to them and raise a complaint and raise a concern. I think it's really important for us to just engage in the broader conversation with our friends and our families around the importance of these issues. For Christians, it's the only way the gospel goes forth in society is if we have the freedom to communicate it.
Yes.
And to access the same, essentially, if we have a level playing field for the gospel to go forward, the gospel will prevail. And the problem right now is we live in a world where there's an incredible amount of hostility to the gospel and to the Bible's message on a whole host of cultural issues. And so it's really important that we continue to keep that door open so that people can walk through it, communicate, advocate for the gospel and into the Bible's teachings on a whole host of cultural issues, gender identity, life, all of it. What we risk is allowing our voice to be muted if we don't demand equal access and equal treatment. We can trust that, if the gospel goes forth, it won't return void.
Yeah, absolutely. So powerful. Well, Jeremy, thank you for joining us today. We're so grateful for your insight that you've provided us, and definitely issues that we need to make sure that we are fully aware so we can engage and we can give voice to hopefully see our rights protected.
Love it. Thank you so much. And if you want to stay up to date with Jeremy Tedesco, you can follow him on X at Jeremy_Tedesco. Make sure and also to check out his work on adflegal.org. Thank you so much for listening to Framework Leadership.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Framework Leadership. If you're watching on YouTube, now would be a great time to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so you can get incredible leadership content right to your YouTube feed. You can also check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts every single week, Framework Leadership. And if you love great email newsletters, and I know I do, make sure you check out keningle.com and subscribe to the Framework Leadership newsletter. It's an incredible piece of content we put out every single week of amazing leadership resources right to your inbox. Make sure you check it out. You can also follow us on Instagram at Kent_Ingle, at Dr. Michael Steiner, on X at Kent Ingle, and on Facebook at Kent.Ingle. Stay up to date on all the incredible things happening on the podcast and at Southeastern University. We love you guys, and we love our followers and our subscribers. Thank you so much for listening to the Framework Leadership Podcast.